The 14 and 1500s were a very strange transitional period, where cannons were rendering many castles obsolete and new technologies such as the starfort had arrived to try and replace them. But not everywhere adapted this new Italian style of fortification. Many countries tried their own methods of making their castles proof against cannons. And we're going to have a look at the very interesting period where cannons were adapted to defend against castles, but their inherent design wasn't changed. The round towers, the high walls, they often still remain, but they were simply adapted to be able to both take cannon and to absorb cannon fire. The first real modification was many castles would add cannon embrasures and gun ports within the walls. For example, Sforza Castle in Milan, where the towers contain gun ports that can sweep along the curtain wall. This was a relatively common and easy modification, and due to early cannons being relatively small, they could often be accommodated in these towers and in the walls of the castle. And this allowed the defenders to use the new devastating firepower of the cannon against any soldiers trying to attack a breach in the wall or to scale the wall with ladders. However, due to the small size of the embrasures, the cannon's size were limited and its arc of fire was also severely limited, and this didn't really help the castle survive against incoming cannonball shots. It just gave it slightly more bite when trying to stop an attacking force. Some later castles would improve on this design, such as Coca Castle in Spain as an example, where they added a proper counterscarp wall. Now the counterscarp is essentially the outer edge of the ditch, which in many castles is just a rough slope. But in this Spanish castle at Coca, they made a proper masonry counterscarp wall so that there's a large drop into the ditch, and they then thickened the wall at the base so that it could better absorb enemy cannon fire. And they also added cannon embrasures both in the towers and the curtain wall high up, but also much lower down in the thicker wall at the ditch level, so that any attackers who got into the ditch could be shot by the cannons at their level, whilst the higher up embrasures could shoot at people attacking who weren't yet in the ditch. And this is, apart from being a very pretty castle, a very interesting transitional design. Now, during the Renaissance, the new Tres Italiane, or bastion fort or star fort, was born in Italy, with round towers replaced with pentagonal bastions, low thick walls, etc, etc. But there were quite a few examples of castles and city walls being adapted to cannons but the design not changing. So for example, Padua, which famously withstood a siege in 1509. Its walls were still largely medieval in trace, but at every corner they had large round towers and the walls were lowered and thickened so that these towers could act as sort of bastions, except they were round instead of pentagonal. And these walls proved very effective and actually survived the siege. And this is an example of still the plan and the trace of a castle, but the design of a star fort in some aspects. The low and thick walls being able to absorb the cannon fire, and the cannons mounted on these round bastions being able to sweep the curtain walls. And this was one of the first instances of proper city walls fully adapted to cannons. One curious design feature, which both appeared and then quite quickly disappeared, was the idea of ballistic shaping. Now, your battlements or crenellations, the pointy bits on top of a castle wall, are generally quite fragile. They're there to protect any guards going along the wall from enemy arrows, maybe a catapult if they're lucky, and to give cover for archers. But against cannons, they weren't brilliant. So, as well as just thickening the walls, often the battlements were thickened and embrasures were given for archers or for other cannons, and they were ballistically shaped into this rounded shape, so that cannonballs, as well as hitting them and then being a lot thicker and able to absorb the punishment, there was also a chance the cannonballs could simply ricochet off and not do anything. Now, this design would then quite quickly fall out of favour, although a lot of star forts, the ramparts still had a very sharp angle to encourage this, but the rounded shaping did generally disappear. But it was quite an interesting design, which a lot of the examples I'll give later use this design, but ultimately it didn't survive the test of time. Now, there are two examples in Croatia that I'd like to draw your attention to, Ston and Dubrovnik. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of Dubrovnik city walls, but Ston are quite interesting. So it had a set of medieval city walls, high, thin, small square towers, the usual, but the Venetians in the 1500s then built a new wall in front of the old medieval wall that was lower and a lot thicker, many times the thickness, and had rounded bastions on the corners. Not quite the pentagonal bastions, but also a lot bigger than your average towers. and this meant any attacking force would have a cannon-proof wall facing them, and then once they'd breached that, they'd still have the old medieval wall. And Ston Castle also went this way and used those ballistic ramparts that I mentioned earlier, as well as having 2 tiers of cannon embrasures firing. And this is quite an interesting example of adding a new wall to an existing medieval fortress to make it cannon-proof. Now, the famous one is Dubrovnik. Everyone knows Dubrovnik city walls, they're worldwide famous, but they're actually a very interesting design because they fall directly into this transitional period. They're not a star fort, they're more like a castle wall, but they were designed with cannons in mind. So when you look, you have the original city walls, and then a very deep ditch, and almost below and much wider are this second set of walls. So any attacker will be faced with a set of walls which are thick enough to withstand cannon and have large round towers with cannons and cannon embrasures. But then also lower down, at about the level of the top of the counterscarp, you'll be faced with, I think the correct term would be a Osprey, which was essentially a second lower wall built into the first. So when you look at a plan of the city walls, you have this really thick base, and then about halfway up it thins, and you have that first set of battlements and that first walkway. And then the slightly thinner, although still thick enough to be cannon-proof wall, goes up much higher. And so anyone at the bottom of the ditch will have an insanely high and thick wall. And even those who were shooting from outside the ditch, even if they managed to completely destroy that upper section of wall, they've still got a large ditch and then a very, very large, high and thick wall in relation to the ditch to get over. Now, as well as this side plan, when you look at the plan from above, you can also clearly see, despite not having the pentagonal bastions, it does have the rounder bastions, like what I mentioned at Padua. And the entire fortress was designed both to mount cannon and to be able to absorb the fire from enemy cannons. And in many ways it would function just like a star fort, with casemated artillery, cannons in the various towers giving a deadly enfilade of fire on any attacking force, a solid counterscarp, huge ditch and very thick walls made an absolutely formidable fortress, and it survived the test of time. Now, despite not being a star fortress, this was a case of medieval city walls being modified to such an extreme extent that they were still effective against cannon for a very long time, and due to the extreme geography of where Dubrovnik is located, a traditional siege such as we saw in mainland Europe would be quite difficult to carry out there. And also due to the politics and geography of the time, it was rarely under a heavy siege, and its walls proved to be very effective all throughout its history, even as late as the Balkan Wars in the 1990s. Another interesting set of castles were the device forts, built by Henry VIII in the 1500s. Now, scared of a joint French-Spanish invasion of England, Henry VIII ordered a series of forts to be built, and these were unique in English history in that they were some of the first forts. They weren't castles for a lord to live in, they were dedicated forts. They were built purely to control a stretch of coastline, to shoot at any enemy shipping landing, to shoot at the troops who were trying to land, and they weren't owned by a lord or lady, they weren't a manor house as well as a fortified residence, they were purely a military fort. And their design is quite interesting. So the famous ones are the castles at Deal and Walmer, but he also built countless others, such as Camber Castle. Now, these castles had essentially rounded bastions. So if we look at Deal Castle, it had a central tower with various rounded bastions around it, and then a second envelope of other rounded bastions, and then a very large ditch and a counterscarp. Now, this is quite an interesting design, also because there was a lot of casemated artillery within these forts. If you look at these photos, you can see at the ditch level there are cannon embrasures with casemates to be able to sweep the ditch. Now, a slight design flaw is that there were far more cannon embrasures and cannon ports than there were either cannons and enough men to crew them. So it would have been a case of using the embrasures that were most needed. But they were a very unique design, and they too used this ballistic shaping that I mentioned earlier. Now, sadly, these designs died off pretty much as soon as they appeared, but they are a very interesting transitional period where they're essentially an evolution of the castle, where they hadn't yet changed to the bastion trace, but they were built to be proof against cannons, unlike regular castles. Now, especially in Italy, but all over Europe, there were many examples of castles where their design didn't really change, but often their walls were thickened and they were given cannon ports and cannon embrasures and sometimes casemates within the walls in towers to be able to then sweep the ditch and sweep the curtain wall, and those thickened walls would help them absorb enemy cannon fire better. For example, there was Ostia Castle, which had 2 round bastions and 1 pentagonal bastion, but then with a large round tower built on top of it, and very thick walls and casemated artillery sweeping the curtain walls. So again, it hasn't quite got to that bastion trace yet. It's not really comparable to older medieval castle designs, because it's designed to mount cannon as a key part of its defence and to be able to absorb the cannon fire from enemies. There are countless other examples too, such as Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome, where very small, almost bastions were added around the medieval towers with cannon embrasures and casemated artillery to try and strengthen the old medieval fortress. There was Cittavia Castellana, which had half round towers and half pentagonal bastion towers, all with cannon embrasures, thick walls, although interestingly no real ditch. It was just quite a high-sided fortress. But this was a real transitional one where half of it looks like it's a Tres Italiana bastion fort and the other half is still reminiscent of a medieval castle. And they've really gone with a half and half approach, a bit like Ostia. Now, Sarzanello Castle in Italy was a really interesting one, as it had 3 round towers, which was much like a medieval fortress, but it had a proper ditch, a counterscarp, a covered way, which is one of the first uses of this, also with plaster arms, which is again one of the first uses, and interestingly it has a large ravelin in front of one of the flat sides, on one of the curtain walls, which essentially gives it almost like a singular bastion to protect that side, and it gives it a very interesting look because you can see the original, not medieval, but older style of castle. Despite it having cannon embrasures and thick walls to absorb the cannon shot, it's still the old plan. But then this new ravelin, the new covered way, makes it a really interesting transition where it was the final step before the complete bastion fortress. This was sort of clinging on to those round towers, but doing everything else like a bastion fort, which makes it a really interesting example. And another one like that is Salsa's castle in the south of France. Now this still had round towers, but the entire castle was lowered, and this was one of the first places to really be lowered to not stick out, to make itself the smallest possible target. And it had very thick and ballistically shaped ramparts and lots of cannon embrasures. And as well as this, they also put almost a precursor to the ravelin in front, very small rounded, not quite gatehouses or barbicans, but they also weren't really a ravelin, they were a strange in-between type of structure. And there was still a proper counterscarp and a deep ditch. Looking from above, the plan is very reminiscent of a medieval castle, but in every other aspect, it's reminiscent of a bastion fort. The only thing it's missing is having pentagonal bastions and triangular ravelins instead of the round ones we're seeing here. But this is essentially a bastion fort without the bastions, but all of the other components of a bastion fort are present, which makes it a really interesting transition piece. After this, most fortresses that we'd see built, if they weren't just simply old medieval walls, were the new bastion trace, the new Tres Italiane, the star forts. However, there's one exception that I do want to touch on before I wrap up, and that is Rhodes. Now, Rhodes was a very formidable city, it had incredible defences, and it withstood a very long siege in 1480, and only just succumbed to a second siege in 1522. But the fortifications themselves are really interesting. So in the first siege, it was relatively simple medieval walls with towers, and there were some bulwarks, which were kind of early bastion built around some of the towers. But it was after that siege and during the second siege that the fortifications are really, really interesting. So they took the old counterscarp of the original very small ditch in front of the medieval wall and turned it into a tenaille, which is essentially a low, thick rampart in front of the medieval wall, and then built a second, much wider and deeper ditch in front. So anyone attacking, as you can see here, would be faced with a ditch, a strong tenaille, a second ditch, and then a double-layered medieval wall. And that medieval wall as well, they widened it so that it was much thicker, able to absorb more punishment, and they also added much better ramparts and cannon embrasures so it could mount cannon on the walls itself. And this made Rhodes a really formidable city. There were also some very early bastions. For instance, St. George's Bastion is possibly one of the first pentagonal bastions ever built. and it was built around the old medieval tower, which served as a sort of redoubt in the middle. And it had casemated artillery on 2 tiers within the bastion, as well as those mounted on top, giving 3 tiers of fire along the ditch in all directions. And there were also other rounded bastions built around other towers. And the medieval wall was almost an afterthought, and all of these other structures were added in front to absorb the punishment from the cannons and to be able to mount its own cannons and fire back. And one other quite interesting addition was one of the first uses of the caponia, which was a covered masonry structure with loopholes on either side to be able to control a ditch. And there's one on Rhodes in a corner which sticks out from the wall and wouldn't look out of place in a 19th century polygonal fort, but it's in a 1400s fortification on Rhodes, and it's really interesting to see one used this early. Now, these fortresses are interesting, and they are a sort of transition from the older medieval castle design moving into the bastion trace, but before the bastion trace had been fully adopted. But many of the components of the bastion trace were used, such as Saluses and Rhodes. You see these lower thick ramparts, and despite the lack of pentagonal bastions and the continuation of round towers, they were adapted for cannons, and indeed the cannon was probably at the forefront of their mind when designing a lot of these castles, as by that time it would have been the primary method of both siege and defence. And so these make a really interesting, almost like a hark back to the older design, but still adapting to cannons, but without fully embracing the new Italian style of bastion fort. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and leave a comment telling me what you think. And share this video with anyone you think would find it interesting. Thank you. Goodbye.